Julius Robert Oppenheimer was born in New York City on April 22, 1904. His middle name makes him known as Robert or J. Robert Oppenheimer. Robert was born to affluent New York Jews. Julius, his father, was born in Hesse-Nassau, Prussia, May 1871. In 1888, 17-year-old Julius Oppenheimer fled Germany for the US amid increasing anti-Semitism in Western and Central Europe. By 1904, when his son Robert was born, he was a successful Manhattan textile executive despite coming from poverty. Ella Friedman, Robert's mother, was born in New York in 1870 to German Jews who emigrated before Julius Oppenheimer. Robert's worldview was shaped by the picture. Ella and Julius had Frank in 1912, 8 years after Robert. Frank also became a physicist, just like his older brother. Young Robert grew up in a wealthy family. His father was a successful New York businessman by the mid-1900s. In the early 1910s, they moved into a large Manhattan apartment on West 88th Street, overlooking the Central Park Reservoir in an affluent district. The family placed Van Gogh, Picasso, and other works on the walls. Robert attended elite New York, ethical culture, and Alcuin preparatory school in the early 1900s. His German granddad sparked his interest in mineralogy at age 5. He joined the Mineralogical Club of New York City at 11, owing to his skill. His intelligence persisted throughout high school. He finished 2 school years in 12 months and was fast-tracked through 8th grade at Alcuin. He became interested in chemistry instead of mineralogy, and physics would eventually summon him. Oppenheimer entered Harvard in 1922, aged 18. Robert wanted to study chemistry. After switching to physics, his chemistry and diverse curiosity remained valuable as scientists grew more specialized. Harvard experimental physicist Professor Percy Bridgman influenced him throughout his time at America's oldest university. Students at leading American universities like Harvard took several courses during this period. Oppenheimer concentrated on history and Greek and Latin classics, still significant in Western curricula in the 1920s. Oppenheimer remembered spending much of his Harvard years reading voraciously in the library. Extra lessons were taken. Oppenheimer received a BA summa cum laude in 3 years at Harvard in 1925, an accomplishment that usually takes 4. This was unusual. Cambridge accepted Oppenheimer before he graduated from Harvard. This has been Britain's major physics centre since Isaac Newton's time in the late 17th century. Oppenheimer was inspired by Lord Ernest Rutherford, the pioneer of nuclear physics, while at Cambridge from 1925 to 1926. Rutherford won the 1908 Nobel Prize in Chemistry for discovering and explaining nuclear half-life and radiation. After his first year at Cambridge, Oppenheimer accepted Max Born's invitation to study under him at Göttingen University, a leading European physics institute. Oppenheimer studied alongside Werner Heisenberg, Enrico Fermi, and Edward Teller, who worked with him on the Manhattan Project during World War II. Oppenheimer obtained his PhD in physics in 1927, less than a year after arriving in Göttingen. After the oral examination, the internal examiner, 1925 Nobel Prize-winning physicist James Franck, was relieved that Oppenheimer had readily defended his dissertation thesis and was ready to interrogate Franck. In his 1927 article on the quantum theory of molecules, Oppenheimer presented the Born-Oppenheimer approximation, demonstrating his theoretical physics potential. He earned his PhD at 23, like Born, his mentor. This includes molecular dynamics, molecule movement, and interaction. Born and Oppenheimer's calculation shows that molecules' heavier nuclei and electrons affect their wave functions. Seat coordinates remain steady. In contrast, wave functions affect lighter electrons more, resulting in more dynamic coordinates. Oppenheimer's knowledge of chemistry and physics helped him rapidly approach their quantum chemistry molecular physics theory. Since the late 1920s, scientists needed the approximation to realistically separate nuclei and electrons. Part 2. His personality. Robert Oppenheimer was mysterious. He was a jocular scientist who switched between introversion and extroversion depending on his mood. He died in his early 60s from smoke exposure as a chain smoker. Those at Harvard, Cambridge, and Göttingen characterized him as an unusual combination of intelligence and inexperience, prone to misjudgment and exaggeration. He became pompous, yet intellectually kind towards students, co-workers, and pupils he taught. Indian and Chinese philosophy and mysticism captivated him. He also acquired the ability to read ancient documents in Sanskrit, the Hindu sacred language. Religious and mystical inclinations were also subjects of interest to him. Oppenheimer utilized physics to investigate the mystical nature of the universe and life with an open-minded philosophy that valued inquiry above facts. Oppenheimer was erratic and impetuous. Students and academics questioned his Harvard stance. He allegedly placed an apple with illness-causing substances in his tutor, Patrick Blackett, with whom he had a troubled relationship before vacationing in France in 1926 at Cambridge. This action and others may have cost him Cambridge studies. Francis Ferguson, a close acquaintance and later stage actor and drama theorist, alleged Oppenheimer attacked and tried to strangle him when he announced his engagement in the 1920s. Many biographers say he was insecure. Born to a German Jewish emigre to America amid rampant Western anti-Semitism, Oppenheimer may have been affected by this hardship. He suffered from depression and isolation, according to some recorded accounts. Part 3. His career. After graduating from Göttingen and publishing papers in England and Germany, Oppenheimer briefly held fellowships at Harvard and the California Institute of Technology before returning to Europe to work at the University of Leiden and Zurich, where Albert Einstein did his early research. His Leiden name was Oppie, a Bowdlerized Dutch variant. Oppenheimer moved to America permanently in 1929 after obtaining many job offers from US organizations. After accepting 2 offers, he became a Berkeley and Caltech physics associate professor. From 1929-1942, he taught at Berkeley in the fall and winter and talked at Caltech in Pasadena. Oppenheimer's teaching methods were recognized in the 1930s in US physics. He founded Berkeley and Caltech's School of Theoretical Physics, where top mid-20th century American scientists trained. An average of 12 advanced graduate students and research fellows worked with Oppenheimer on theoretical physics problems. Oppenheimer visited them regularly throughout hectic periods to advise and check their progress. Several biographers note that he inspired his pupils to address pressing human issues. Oppenheimer and his colleagues studied Plato in Greek or Sanskrit when not arguing physics in their heterogeneous academic environment. Hans Bethe, who met Oppenheimer in the late 1920s and 1930s, said Robert was secluded in California and heard about the Wall Street crash months later. Oppenheimer and his Berkeley and Caltech students made significant scientific advancements in the 1930s. Oppenheimer predicted the positron, an electron antiparticle, in 1930. In 1932, Oppenheimer's Caltech student Carl David Anderson established its existence. Wendell Furry and Oppenheimer developed the electron-positron hypothesis and its interactions. Oppenheimer worked closely with Melba Phillips, a pioneering US female physicist at a time when ladies were rare. They invented the Oppenheimer-Phillips process in 1935, which releases a proton by fusing the neutron half of a deuteron with a target nucleus. According to this research, deuterons may turn certain materials radioactive, and nuclear interactions may occur at lower energy than expected. With these and other achievements, Oppenheimer and his Berkeley and Caltech students made California a theoretical physics center in the mid-20th century. Part 4. His personal life. Oppenheimer had a turbulent personal life. He had mild tuberculosis in the late 1920s. He later had a New Mexico property after seeking dry desert air in Arizona and New Mexico. He dated Jean Tatlock, a psychiatry student and daughter of Old English scholar and Geoffrey Chaucer expert John Strong Tatlock, in the mid-1930s. John, 10 years Robert's junior, had depression and sexual dysfunction. Oppenheimer dated Caltech botanist and scientist Kitty Harrison, who divorced her second husband, Stuart Harrison, in November 1940 and married Robert the following day despite their stormy relationship. Oppenheimer may have visited Tatlock occasionally in the early 1940s until her January 1944 suicide. Robert and Kitty married when Kitty was pregnant and had 2 children, Peter in May 1941 and Catherine in 1944, named after her mother. The Second World War in the autumn of 1939 disturbed Oppenheimer's life, as it did many others in Europe, North Africa, North America, and Asia. Part 5: Second World War and the Manhattan Project. The disagreement began in 1933 when Adolf Hitler's Nazis took power in Germany. Anti-Semitic nationalist and fascist Nazis wanted to murder Jews in Germany and ignite a new war in Europe to reverse the Treaty of Versailles and build a Third Reich. Oppenheimer knew Nazis. Despite being a non-observant Jew, he donated 3% of his income to German Jews escaping the Nuremberg laws in 1934. Nazi anti-Jewish actions grew from 1936, culminating in the 1938 takeover of Austria and Czechoslovakia. After Poland was invaded in September 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany. US public opinion wasn't yet ready for a European war. America remained neutral for the first 2 years of the conflict. London received significant military aid from Roosevelt from the outset of the competition. December 1941 transformed Oppenheimer's life and legacy. After the Nazis took Poland in the autumn of 1939, Denmark and Norway in the spring of 1940, and the Low Countries and France in the summer of 1940, the US remained neutral. Germany looked set to dominate Europe when Italy, Hungary, and Romania joined the Nazis and invaded Britain's North African and Russian possessions in the summer of 1941. The ultra-nationalist Empire of Japan, seeking an Asian and Pacific empire, unilaterally invaded the US in the early 1940s. On December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor in Hawaii and other US colonies, including the Philippines, were bombed, launching World War II. The US attacked Germany, Italy, and other Axis powers in days, causing Northern Hemisphere combat. American research focused on Oppenheimer throughout the fight. Nazi Germany sought a WMD to rapidly win the war. Germany had top scientists in the 1920s and 1930s, making it suitable for nuclear weapon development. The Berlin team, led by Otto Robert Frisch and Lise Meitner, discovered nuclear fission in 1938. This finding was used in Nazi nuclear weapon experiments the next year. Nuclear reactor research and heavy water atomic bomb research were done in Nazi-occupied Norway during the war. In August 1939, Hungarian nuclear scientists Leo Szilard and Albert Einstein wrote to President Roosevelt in Washington, D.C., warning about Nazi experiments. This issue was revived in 1941 when the US joined the war after modest attempts in 1939 and 1940. Oppenheimer led the Manhattan Project's Los Alamos laboratory during WW2. From 1942's Manhattan Island headquarters, the squad got its name. It employed 130,000 people nationwide after 1942. They completed project components in many states. Chicago scientists, alongside Oppenheimer's old Göttingen colleagues Enrico Fermi and Leo Szilard, who alerted Roosevelt about the Nazi nuclear effort, built the first atomic reactor during the war. A team at the Hanford site in Washington state and another in Tennessee created plutonium from uranium for nuclear bombs. Manhattan Project personnel spied across Europe to expose Nazism. Oppenheimer managed the Manhattan Project's top researchers at Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico. He nearly didn't get this position. Major General Leslie Groves, Manhattan Project manager. Groves, a lesser-known character, headed the Manhattan Project, which created the first nuclear weapon and the Pentagon. Oppenheimer was presented to Groves in 1942 to lead the Manhattan Project's theoretical physicists and scientists. Groves initially preferred a Nobel Prize-winning physicist to lead a top academic team. He was confident Oppenheimer always got the most outstanding results from his colleagues. He contacted Oppenheimer after interviewing and approving him. Oppenheimer sought a remote location to build a research center in the early winter of 1942. Future tests may include nuclear weapons. After moving to Los Alamos, New Mexico, he founded a research institute in an abandoned school. War Department subcontracted it to UC Oppenheimer, directed Los Alamos Laboratory, and could hire and fire. Although hiring would outweigh firing. Los Alamos's peak employment was approximately 5,000, exceeding Oppenheimer's projections. Oppenheimer's Los Alamos team comprises renowned first-half 20th century scientists. In 1922, Oppenheimer joined Harvard physicist and mathematician John Hasbrouck van Vleck. His electrical magnetism research won a 1977 Nobel Prize. Van Vleck developed the Hiroshima bomb's gun. Robert Serber, Oppenheimer's Berkeley colleague and Los Alamos organizational scientist, called the bombs used in the first test explosion and against Japan Thin Man, Little Boy, and Fat Man, inspired by detective films and books like The Maltese Falcon. In 1967, German-born theoretical physicist Hans Bethe received the Nobel Prize. His critical mass calculation was essential to Los Alamos's bomb design. Finally, Los Alamos recruited Hungarian-born Jew Edward Teller. Like Oppenheimer, he studied in Germany in the late 1920s. Later, he moved to America. Teller worked at Fermi's Chicago reactor before traveling to New Mexico. Teller was Oppenheimer's closest Los Alamos associate. The first atomic weapon was developed at Los Alamos by hundreds of engineers, metallurgists, chemists, and military personnel. A huge problem faced by this team of physicists, engineers, and scientists. Most of Los Alamos knowledge was nuclear chain reaction theory. The Los Alamos team of Oppenheimer and others sought to build and forecast a nuclear weapon. 1943 and 1944 saw substantial experimental and theoretical research. All along, Oppenheimer worked hard. Hans Bethe remembered his rapid grasp of essential topics and capacity to comprehend every facet years afterwards. Neither led from headquarters. Oppenheimer's Los Alamos work regimen was physically and psychologically taxing, affecting his health. Growing so underweight, he lost 20 pounds while working in New Mexico, reaching 110 pounds or less than 8 stone. Research at Los Alamos in 1943 focused on the Thin Man prototype. This plutonium gun exploded like an artillery cannon, not an implosion bomb. The initiator needed polonium from Ontario ores and production in Tennessee, part of the Manhattan Project, or at Hanford in Washington State. Research logistics took a lot of work. The design took more work. To explode, the gun-type weapon must accelerate a plutonium projectile to over 3,000 feet per second or 3,200 kilometers per hour. Otherwise, nuclear fission would begin. The high-speed gun barrel necessary for the Thin Man idea was too large for a B-29 flying superfortress bomb. Therefore, it was scrapped in 1944. The new heavy bombers were intended to deliver any US nuclear weapon. The Thin Man concept was scrapped in April 1944 due to plutonium concerns in gun-type bombs. Oppenheimer used many scientists and engineers from Little Boy Fat Man to work on Little Boy after abandoning Thin Man. Unlike the Thin Man, this gun-type fission bomb exploded using uranium-235. A third design was also created. Plutonium-based Fat Man weapon was designed for implosion. American physicist Seth Neddermeyer led the design team. Although the Fat Man was created in 1943 and 1944, Oppenheimer favored the gun-type design. Oppenheimer sent Hungarian-born mathematician and physicist John von Neumann to Los Alamos in 1943 to review the design, exhibiting his supervision abilities. Von Neumann advocated a spherical design with shaped charges to decrease plutonium usage and simplify implosion bomb manufacturing. After months of trying, Los Alamos metallurgists created a plutonium-gallium alloy spherical plated with nickel. The design was almost complete. As 1945 started at Los Alamos, Oppenheimer's teams were finishing the Little Boy and Fat Man designs. There were two nuclear weapon success potential. Both programs were completed in March 1945, with design difficulties overcome and enriched uranium and plutonium produced in Washington and Tennessee. The Manhattan Project had to enrich fissile compounds, which was costly and time-consuming given the equipment available. Other difficulties were mostly engineering-related. Using 1,500 bolts to make the 1944 Fat Man bomb was inappropriate. Oppenheimer's team reduced bolts to 90 in the early summer of 1945. Technological challenges included bomb drop from height. The fall of a Fat Man and Little Boy-like bomb was tested in 1944 and 1945. All this occurred in April 1945. Oppenheimer told Major Leslie Groves in June that the Manhattan Project was ready for a test explosion. The Jornada del Muerto Desert in New Mexico hosted the Trinity nuclear test on July 16, 1945. This desert is called Dead Man's Route in Spanish. In 1962, Oppenheimer told Groves he named the test Trinity after reading John Donne's sacred poetry. The test used a plutonium-based Fat Man weapon to implode. The test explosive was called the Gadget. The test was conducted in a remote, unpopulated location for safety. A German immigrant built the McDonald Ranch residence in 1913, the only residence on the explosion site. In 1942, the McDonald family had to relocate because the Manhattan Project took over the farm. Due to the enormous cost of plutonium manufacture, particularly the difficult enrichment process, the test was methodically arranged. Success mattered. Groves declined to defend the desert annihilation of billions of dollars of plutonium to a congressional committee. The Trinity test was done around dawn on July 16th. North, south, and west observation shelters were erected 9 kilometers from the explosion site. UV-protected goggles. For its radioactive half-life, the distance was safe. The morning's observers included Oppenheimer, Teller, Bethe, Fermi, and von Neumann. Not everyone believed the bomb would work. Its destructive potential alarmed others. When the Gadget exploded at 5:29 a.m., 25,000 tons of TNT energy provided answers. A 3rd-kilometer crater melted the launch site sand into a light green glass-like rock. Witnesses 9 kilometers away did not hear the powerful shockwave for 40 seconds after the incident. The fireball became purple, green, and orange to white as it expanded. It spiraled 12 kilometers into the sky like a mushroom cloud. Shockwaves from explosions reached 100 kilometers. After the bomb burst, persons in observation shelters 9 kilometers away experienced extreme heat, like standing in front of an oven. Recent comments by Oppenheimer after viewing the Trinity test explosion have become renowned. Source: The Bhagavad Gita, the Song by God, a revered Hindu text from the second part of the 1st century BC. Prince Arjuna and Krishna discuss moral and religious issues in the 700-verse Gita. Despite common assumptions, Oppenheimer did not quote a Gita line where Vishnu says, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The phrase would have been fitting that morning in New Mexico, but Oppenheimer never said it. When recalling the event 20 years later, he remembered a Gita line that says, "If 1,000 suns burst into the sky, that would be like the splendor of the Mighty One." After thinking in 1965, he preferred the alternative term. Contrary to common misconception, Oppenheimer never remarked, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Despite the Manhattan Project's triumph, observation shelters were cheerful. It was said that Oppenheimer was smiling. The results were seen within weeks. The atomic bomb was used soon after the Trinity test. Part 6. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Allies invaded Germany from east and west in 1945, concluding the European War. In late April, Hitler committed himself in Berlin, and the Nazis surrendered a week later. The Empire of Japan refused to sacrifice, and their honor and military tradition advised invading their islands to end the Pacific War. The US projected millions of Japanese losses in the last battle. After President Roosevelt died in mid-April 1945, President Harry Truman rapidly determined to show the new atomic bomb's availability to the Japanese government. On August 6, 1945, a little boy bomb hit Hiroshima. After a good night at Los Alamos, Oppenheimer lamented not having the weapon against the Nazis in Germany. 3 days later, the US dropped a second Fat Man bomb on Nagasaki, Japan, disappointing everyone. Indeed, Oppenheimer and his colleagues deemed this intolerable. Japanese surrendered 6 days after the first Nagasaki bombing because they were not given enough time to realize the consequences and chose to surrender. It terminated the fight. Nuclear weapons were only used in war in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They're controversial. Most experts agree with Oppenheimer and colleagues that the first Hiroshima bombing was justifiable but regretful to compel Japanese capitulation and avert a ground invasion. The bombing of Nagasaki 3 days later was unnecessary, according to most. More broadly, Oppenheimer and his Manhattan Project colleagues' wartime labor has been morally questioned. Two viewpoints exist. Deterrence has averted superpower and large government wars since 1945, despite nuclear weapons' existential threat. Europe battled for millennia. This changed when it became evident that open conflict may destroy both sides. Although nuclear weapons have brought nuclear peace, the risks persist in a 21st century world with increasingly antagonistic and destabilized politics. After the war, Oppenheimer's American academic renown soared. Thus, he gained possibilities. He traveled from Berkeley to the East Coast in 1947 to head Princeton's Institute for Advanced Studies, a famous physics institute with Einstein, Bohr, and Dirac as graduates. Oppenheimer drew new physicists there. 6 of his promising graduate students followed him at Princeton after Berkeley. He employed 1930s California methods to encourage discussion and research in New Jersey, often at his own expense. Princeton produced no Oppenheimer works. This made the institute the leading US physics center in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The institute was home to physicists, including Yoichiro Nambu, who co-earned the 2008 Nobel Prize for finding spontaneously broken symmetry in subatomic physics, and Murray Gell-Mann, who received the 1969 Nobel Prize for elementary particle research. Princeton's Oppenheimer had various government positions and security clearance to analyze classified nuclear project documents in the late 1940s and 1950s. The UN-led Atomic Energy Commission, founded in 1947 to promote peace after the war, included him. The Energy Commission oversaw nuclear proliferation and atomic weapons production. After 1945, only the US had nuclear weapons. Still, other countries rapidly followed. Oppenheimer and other Manhattan Project members imposed nuclear proliferation constraints in 1946 and 1947, which remain in force. As the Commission's first chairman, Oppenheimer sought to halt a Cold War nuclear arms race between the US and USSR. Failure sparked a significant atomic arms race when the Soviets successfully tested a nuclear weapon in 1949. Part 7. A hydrogen bomb. After the Soviet Union got a nuclear weapon in 1949, President Harry Truman contemplated developing a hydrogen or thermonuclear bomb, a more powerful nuclear weapon than the Manhattan Projects, deployed against Japan in 1945. From 1942 to 1945, Oppenheimer and other Los Alamos laboratory scientists opposed nuclear warfare because they may do major harm and initiate a nuclear war that would wipe out most life on Earth. They petitioned the government in late 1949, arguing that thermonuclear weapons threaten mankind more than military advantage. Truman authorized the redesigned proposal in January 1950. The first hydrogen bomb was exploded on a Pacific Ocean island nearly 3 years later in November 1952. The Ivy Mike weapon blasted over 10 million tons of TNT and was 450 times more powerful than the 1945 US atomic bomb on Nagasaki. The Cold War was reaching mutually assured tragedy, notwithstanding Oppenheimer and others' reservations. Oppenheimer, a Manhattan Project leader and top government scientist, encountered official resistance during the early 1950s Second Red Scare. After Germany was partitioned into Western-aligned West Germany and Communist East Germany, NATO and the Warsaw Pact were founded, intensifying the Cold War. The Korean War was the first significant Western communist proxy war. America initially had reasonable fears about communist outfits working as a fifth column for the USSR. However, this caused false anxiety about socialist politics and the ACLU. Senator Joseph McCarthy's push to discover and prosecute communists exacerbated the Second Red Scare from 1950 to 1954. Second Red Scare concerns hit Oppenheimer. After being politically inactive in his teens, Oppenheimer got involved with American socialist and left-wing political organizations and civil rights movements in the mid-1930s. He joined left-wing and progressive organizations in 1936, when the Soviet Union and Communist parties backed the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War, seeing socialist parties as the resistance to fascism in Europe. Oppenheimer did not join the Communist Party of the United States, even though Jan Tatlock, his wife Kitty, and his brother Frank were. Robert joined radical organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union in the 1930s and 1950s, which led the civil rights fight that ended segregation. This made officials wary about Oppenheimer. Since the father was born in Germany, the US joining the Second World War made matters worse. The Nazi Berlin regime would have rejected Oppenheimer due to his Jewish heritage. Suspected Oppenheimer. Despite being a key Manhattan Project participant, he was monitored throughout World War II. FBI had a file on him. Oppenheimer testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1949 on his politics. He admitted that many of his famous 1930s Berkeley students were Communist Party members. He claimed never to be a member. 4 years later, in early winter 1953, the FBI wrongly assumed Oppenheimer was a Soviet asset in the US after a short interview. Americans were thus paranoid during the Second Red Scare. Oppenheimer was advised to resign once his US security clearance expired in mid-December 1953. Oppenheimer requested a closed-door hearing for this rejection in late April 1954. Former colleague Edward Teller stated that he had questioned Oppenheimer's conduct as Los Alamos laboratory director, bringing him down. Oppenheimer lost his security clearance and went into political and social exile in the mid-1950s for this treason. Oppenheimer struggled following his security hearing and clearance revocation. Split academic view. Oppenheimer was backed by his colleagues, but American university administrators cancelled some of his presentations and appearances. Oppenheimer avoided warning the government and American society about nuclear proliferation like Einstein after losing confidence. Oppenheimer moved to the US-controlled Virgin Islands in the Caribbean to spend more time away from the US on St. John. He acquired an estate on Gibney Beach, now Oppenheimer Beach. His stay lasted years after 1957. Even yet, numerous American institutions and groups asked him to speak. His 1950s scientific output was modest, with few publications. The late 1950s witnessed widespread efforts to rehabilitate Oppenheimer. France awarded him the Légion d'honneur in 1957 for his wartime Allies service, foreign member of the British Royal Society since 1962. American public knew that the Second Red Scare had overstepped its limitations by punishing individuals with tenuous connections to the American Communist movement and no real Soviet ties. Oppenheimer received the 1956 US Department of Energy Enrico Fermi Award from President John F. Kennedy in 1963. The prize recognizes Italian-American physicist Enrico Fermi, who invented the first nuclear reactor in Chicago in 1942 during the Manhattan Project. Stomach cancer killed Fermi early in 1954. Von Neumann, Bethe and Teller in 1956, 1961 and 1962 received the award for their contributions at Los Alamos under Oppenheimer from 1943 to 1945. Oppenheimer's 1963 prize retrospectively acknowledged the government's Red Scare prosecution mistake. Part 8. Oppenheimer death. Before enjoying his rediscovered fame, Oppenheimer died. In late 1965, he was diagnosed with throat cancer from chain smoking 2 years after winning the Fermi Award. Curable tumours become lethal then. Oppenheimer fell into a coma in 1967 and died at home in Princeton on February 18th despite intensive treatment. His age was 62. Although the 1963 Enrico Fermi Award somewhat repaired his image, nearly 600 academic, scientific and military colleagues, many of whom had worked with Oppenheimer at Los Alamos, attended his memorial ceremony to pay respect. His urn was placed in the Caribbean Sea off St. John's Island. His reputation was fully rebuilt over decades. Although Edward Teller testified against Oppenheimer in a 1954 closed-door session, the American scientific community disregarded him for decades. Part 9. Nobel Prize. Posthumous nomination for a third Nobel Prize in Physics in 1967. In 1946, 1951 and 1967, he was appointed but not honoured. Great have wondered why he didn't get the Nobel Prize despite his great accomplishments. There are good reasons for his reluctance. Einstein authored almost 300 scientific publications and numerous books, whereas Oppenheimer published fewer. In contrast, Oppenheimer published just 5 academic papers after WW2. He made contributions to various physics fields, although he did not make Nobel Prize-winning theoretical or practical discoveries. Scientists get Nobel Prizes for individual accomplishments, not lifetime achievements. Photoelectric effects won Einstein his main. Thus, Oppenheimer did not get a Nobel Prize for science. Others say his gravitational collapse research deserves one. His career accomplishments included supervising physicist and other scientific teams. This made him the ideal wartime Los Alamos laboratory director. Oppenheimer is a famous theoretical physicist. Part 10. Conclusion. His studies from the 1920s to 1960s greatly improved our knowledge of the cosmos, including the Born-Oppenheimer approximation and the Oppenheimer-Phillips principle. The 1935 explanation by Oppenheimer and Melba Phillips enabled a deuteron-induced nuclear reaction. His position as director of the Los Alamos Laboratory in the Manhattan Project will always be recognized. Oppenheimer led US attempts to produce an atomic weapon during WW2. Despite the moral and existential ramifications of introducing such weapons, this study was deemed important at the time. Oppenheimer was concerned about the impact of his work and fought against the creation of more destructive weapons of mass destruction throughout the post-war era. This led to his persecution and prosecution by the government he worked for in the early 1950s, and his exile during the Second Red Scare. However, his legacy endures. One of the greatest physicists of contemporary times, Oppenheimer was an unusual individual who had a unique perspective on the physical cosmos. Thoughts on Robert Oppenheimer? Was he the most important person in the Manhattan Project and deserving of a Nobel Prize? We appreciate your feedback in the comments area and thank you for viewing.